Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 94 of That's a Good Question. Roe is overturned. Should Christians impose their morality on others? Welcome to this episode of That's a Good Question. The last 30 hours or so have been pretty eventful.
Yes.
Just yesterday, the Supreme Court released its Hobbs decision, which overturned the 49-year-old precedent of Roe versus Wade. So as of right now, abortion is no longer a constitutional right in our country.
Wow.
So today we want to talk about what that means practically, and then spend some time discussing when and why Christians should seek to impose our version of morality on others. Since often we're asked, who are you to cram your morality down my throat?
Right.
So let's start with talking about some practical effects of this court's decision.
Well, as we've said in past episodes, the overturning of Roe, which was then only potential when we would talk about it in the past, it's now actual. It doesn't result in abortion being outlawed throughout the country. Instead, it turns the decision back to the individual states to decide whether it will be allowed, and if it is allowed, under what conditions. Most estimates that I've seen say that the 50 states will divide almost evenly between those who outlaw abortion and those that allow it. Some states have in place what are called trigger laws. In fact, our state of Michigan has one going back to 1931. Well, let me rephrase that. The trigger laws were put in place more recently in different states in anticipation that if Roe is overturned, then these laws would go into effect that outlaw or severely restrict abortion. In Michigan, though, we have this law that goes back to 1931 that is still on the books. And so now that law can legally go into effect unless some action is taken. Now, it's been appealed, so it's not going into immediate effect. The Michigan legislature, like other state houses around the country, they're going to need to decide what the law in their particular state is going to be. Now, the Right to Life organization in Michigan has always been very, very strong. Even though we have a pro-abortion governor and we have our two senators are also pro-abortion, but it's been a very pro-life state, actually, and pro-life in Lansing, our capital. So it will not surprise me then if even though we have those Democrats and pro-abortion folks in high places, that they are actually able to make some moves with the wiggle room that's allowed now with the overturning of Roe. I do wonder whether there's going to be violence.
Can I ask for clarification? When you say wiggle room, not really wiggle room, free latitude. Really, the legislature can do what legislatures do now.
That's correct. Yeah. Right. It's up to the legislature.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I say it that way on purpose because that's been our complaint for all this time is, you've got a court then effectively legislating the decision for every state.
Yes, exactly. Now, there was another, this is unrelated to abortion, but there was another decision that came down today that was released right before the abortion one that was on gun rights. And the people who want to see fewer guns are actually saying, and they did exactly the same thing with the guns that we've been complaining about on the other side with abortion for all these years. And that is they've made it a constitutional right now in very clear terms to bear arms, meaning you have the right to conceal and carry. So it's funny how that complaint goes both ways depending on the decision and who's making it.
Yeah, and this is not the subject of this podcast, but I could see the response from pro-gun lobby being, well, that is expressly stated in the Constitution.
Yeah, I know. So that's not a small matter.
Right.
For sure, yeah. But I do wonder now, what's going to happen? Are we going to have violence as people react to what has been a right for over a generation, and now it's being taken away by an unelected group of judges? So you can hear the same kind of complaint that we're saying, those unelected judges, implode. It's similar to how, for all of these decades, we've complained about unelected judges in 1973 reversing the laws of 50 states on abortion and making it a right. And now the court's taking it away, something that had been a right. So it will not surprise me if we have certainly a lot of protests, which is fine, but it won't surprise me if there's some violence. In fact, already today, And in recent weeks, there have been some attacks on crisis pregnancy centers.
Yeah, heard about
And
those.
just this week, in, again, our state of Michigan, one of our congressmen, a Republican congressman, pro-life, had his office vandalized. And right next to his office is a crisis pregnancy center, and that also was vandalized. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah. So since 1973, no state could outlaw abortion, and for a very long time, not even really restrict it. So it meant that pro-life politicians could say whatever they wanted, really speak in very strong terms against abortion, which would endear them to us conservative voters, because they knew they really wouldn't be required to put their actions where their mouths were. But now their positions are going to have real world consequences, because now they can't just talk about it. They can vote about it and enact laws to do away with it completely. So we're going to be looking to them to do that.
Exactly right. And I've been wondering for a good while, since this Dobbs decision has been teed up at the Supreme Court, and we've all been waiting for it to come down. And oral arguments happened in something like December, and at the oral arguments, it really did seem like the justices the majority were inclined to overturn Roe. Then we had the leaked decision, remember, and that turned out to be the decision that came out today that did do away with it. And so for all of that time now, you're thinking, what are these pro-life politicians going to do now that they have to stand up and be counted? Now, I see that today, just today, former Vice President Mike Pence, who wants to be president in 24, said that the decision, that after this decision now, he favors a national law from our Congress in Washington, D.C. to outlaw abortion in all 50 states. So he's not satisfied with just leaving it up to the various states. No, this is something that should be outlawed in all 50 states. On the other hand, President Biden made a statement just hours after the decision saying Congress should make abortion legal in all 50 states. So now that the issue's out of the courts, it's into the hands of elected officials, it's going to be fought out at the state and at the national levels as well.
Yeah. So you would be in favor of a national ban, or for allowing each state to make its choice? What do you see any wisdom?
Well, I think a pro-life position requires that we seek to have the taking of innocent human life outlawed, everywhere in our country, not just in some states.
Yeah. So, I agree. Yeah. But then, so you think about, you realize that this is quite an imposition of what we believe to be, to impose on people who you said have been under the impression that this is a right, millions who don't agree with us. So it raises the question that I said in the title of this podcast, what issues do we do this with? Since we don't try to put into law everything that we think is, a matter of right and wrong. As pastors, for example, we believe that it's right to go to church on Sundays, to come and worship the Lord. But we don't try to get that enacted as a law so that everyone's required to do that. So let's talk about why some things fit this category and others don't. Or this approach.
A big issue, isn't it? It really is. But my answer is, I don't mind imposing morality that people have just by virtue of being people, that they have just by virtue of who we are, and I'll explain. I don't mind saying that this is something that by virtue of being human, you are to do and you are to adhere to. And I don't mind imposing that. In order to legislate that you have to attend church on Sunday, everyone would need to have a Bible. And really, those people would need to be Christian to understand and to desire, doing that. And that's because those things are found in what we call special revelation. Special revelation is revelation given to a specific audience with specific information. The Bible fits under special or specific revelation as opposed to general revelation. Other things then are known to human beings, people, not by specific revelation like in the Bible, but by general revelation in the form of conscience that all people have and creation. And both of those tell all people at least some things about right and wrong. There is and this is what it's called by philosophers and theologians, natural law. to which all people have access. They all have access. Why? Because it's general. It's in general revelation, in creation and conscience, and to which then they should be held accountable. Now, I had a dialogue this week with an author who contacted me because she had read some quotes from me in an article. And she was asking about, because the article said that I see abortion as, quote, inherently biblical. And so she wrote and said, so tell me about that. And we had a kind back and forth about my views on abortion and why I take a strong stance on it. And I said this to her in one of my replies. I said, all humanity should be held accountable to natural law, which by definition does not require a text because it's in nature. I mentioned specifically protection of human life, sexuality, and marriage. And she responded by asking, now, how universal in reality are the principles you name? In rootedness in creation, you appear to invoke a doctrine of natural law, but that seems to be inherently religious, she says. You're construing that creation to be divine, absolutely authoritative, and, she says, interpreted through the Jewish and Christian lens, right? There is certainly no universal agreement on what life or heterosexuality or marriage is or should be. Then she went on to show how different cultures around the world handle all of those, life and sexuality and marriage.
Yeah, so you're saying you don't mind imposing something that should be universally understood and observed.
Yeah.
But she's saying it's not universally observed
Right.
and proves that it's not universally understood, right?
That's what she's saying. Yeah.
So because it's not agreed upon, it's not universally understood.
Yes.
And she says it's religious then, and we know that religion is not uniform across all culture and times. And
Yeah, so how then, if that being the case, not everybody observes it the same way, and it's religious, and religion is not uniform over all cultures and time and places. So how do you come off saying, hey, you should be held accountable for all of this? So yeah, that's right. For her and for many, the existence of contrary approaches means that no approach is authoritative. But I said to her, and I say to our audience, that all reality is inherently religious because all people have a God consciousness. And there are universal obligations that flow from that, including the protection of life, heterosexuality, and marriage. These are first principles, I told her, upon which all societies are built, and they are assumed. Now, this is something to contemplate. We won't have time to go into all of it here, but think about this. They are assumed, these foundational first principles are assumed in the myriad, what I call to her as digressions that exist out there, digressions of the way you approach life and the way you approach marriage and so on. I mean, there are those differences, but I'm calling them digressions. Now, I said to her, I'm refraining from calling them perversions because I'm not trying to be pejorative, but you could say that too. It's a distortion.
Technically accurate. You're calling them distortions.
That's right. And I also pointed out to her that these things predate the Jewish or Christian lens, technically. Yes, they're described in the opening chapters of Genesis, life and marriage and heterosexuality. But remember, Genesis is only written after the digressions made explanation necessary. In other words, there was no, in the beginning, there was no explanation needed. This was inherent in nature. This is the way it was. Just think about it for a second. When Cain murders Abel, that is just, you read the narrative, and that is just assumed to be wrong. And God comes and says, Cain, what have you done?
There's no parenthetical, and this was known to be wrong.
No, none of that. And there's no seminar that takes place on, on the Ten Commandments, which hadn't been given yet and aren't going to be given until thousands of years later. So you don't take human life. It's in nature, it's in creation, and it was understood immediately. So the fact that life and sexuality and marriage have been distorted over time and place doesn't negate their binding authority.
Yeah, murder was wrong before it ever became a part of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, exactly. And like we said, with Cain and Abel, and you have even before Moses gives the Ten Commandments in about 1500 BC. Before that, you have Hammurabi. in his code of law, Babylonian code of laws. And it has very similar kinds of things. Why? Because these are universal, because they go back to creation. And sexuality and marriage are likewise laws of nature that are necessary to explain their deviations. In other words, you start with life and its protection, and cultures in which that does not occur are what I'm calling digressions, they're deviations, they're distortions. You start with common human sexuality before you see distortions of it historically.
So it seems important to establish that natural law precedes laws that we make, and those laws then have priority over other laws that we enact. It should be consistent with those first principles. When we make a law, it should be in concert with the fundamental, universal natural law.
That's correct. And that by its very nature, natural law it precedes the laws that we make. Now, for those interested in reading more about this, I recommend a book in our resource center. So for those who have access to our resource center or on Amazon, it's called In the Beginning, God, A Fresh Look at the Case for Original Monotheism. And it's written by Winfried Corduan, Corduan. And I did a class on world religions. We've done that a couple of times here, and I recommended that book because that original monotheism idea is something that is, yes, at the heart of what I'm saying here, that you have a God consciousness because you have a God who created, and then that God who created, now we are all related to, aware of. And he is the one who has given then these laws naturally in and at creation and in our conscience. So
kind of built into us.
Built in,
what we're saying.
Inherent to us. Exactly. And that's why I said, as people, going back to the beginning of today, I don't mind imposing on people things that they should be doing because they're people.
That
because they're
we
human
believe
beings.
Probably resonate at some level with every human anyways because of the image of God in them.
Yeah.
You might be planning to talk about this later in the discussion, but I thought about, as you were describing natural law preceding human laws, and that we're really trying to codify those things. Yes. So we recognize there are distortions of natural law happening because the image of God in us is being distorted by sin.
Right.
So then we're trying to recapture in our codification of law, human law, what we all in our hearts know to be natural law, or at some level in our being.
We still know those natural laws at some level, as you say. Sometimes we have to go kind of deep into the levels because things are not the way they were originally made. Yeah. So there's the fall, and so things are distorted. That's why we have the digressions that we have. I mentioned this dialogue that I had by email with this lady, and the kind dialogue that I had with her. And then the day that Roe, so it'll be yesterday when our folks write this, Roe was decided, and she had originally written to me to ask about my position on abortion, right? Yeah. And then Roe is overturned. And she wrote to me, and now the kind tone changed. Yeah, it did change. And I wrote back in a kind tone and said, "Hey, let's not go with the personal attacks here. Yeah. No need to do that." But it does raise the question: why did that happen? I mean, it happened very quickly. Now, she was clearly upset over Roe being overturned. I can't prove this, but I think part of it is I was saying to her things like we're saying here, and I think that resonates at a deep level. I think there's a guilt there that human beings struggle with because we are human. We know this. Then when somebody brings it up and points it out and says we need to be held accountable to it, but we don't want to be, then it creates some real friction. Yeah. So, we on our side still just need to be kind about it and all of that, but don't be surprised if that happens, and that's what happened in this case. So in that book, Original Monotheism, Corduan, he makes the case that other forms of religious experience are, as I've said, digressions from that which is natural, that which is original, thus the original monotheism. Since these are natural, they've been around as long as nature. That is, they go back to creation and being made in the image of God and having a Godward orientation that understands, naturally, that human life is sacred, that sex is hetero, that marriage then is also. So when the basis of our imposition on others, back to the question now, under what circumstances should we feel comfortable imposing? When the basis of that imposition is natural law, I'm quite comfortable codifying it as all people have access to it and are to follow it. It begins with the sacredness of life.
Yeah, but as you said, life and sex and marriage are all inherently religious because all of life is connected to God. Yeah. And Paul says pretty much this exact thing in Romans 1, 8 through 32. We know God, and yet we pervert what we know of him and his standards, including, and he gets specific about sexuality.
Correct.
So, and then in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, our conscience reflects the existence of natural law.
Yeah.
So if we're going to impose those standards regarding life, and that's connected to our knowledge of God who created the standards, then why should we not require allegiance to God in all of our laws? And some of our Christian brothers suggest this.
Yes. No, it's an excellent question. But with protection of life and sexuality and marriage, we're regulating behavior, not belief.
And as we talked in preparation for this episode, I immediately thought when that came up, but all of our behavior is based on belief.
True.
Right?
Good point, as always. But for legal purposes, I don't need your agreement with the belief that underlies it, just to ensure that you behave in a way consistent with it. That's what law, you don't have to agree ideologically with the law. You simply have to obey it. And that's what we're looking for here. And I don't mind that because I do know at some level, you're having, as a human being, you're having to struggle with this. The fact that you distort it, that you digress from it, that all of that, I don't have to have all of that. I just need you to do it, and I'm okay with forcing or imposing it upon you because it's something you have access to and you were made to obey. Now, yes, you should believe it because it's general revelation, and so you're accountable to believe it. But if you don't, that's on you. And I want to, yes, as a Christian, see you converted. But in the meantime, I have no trouble imposing on you what you should agree to do anyway.
And as you said earlier, every law is imposing something on somebody. If they didn't vote for the law, if they wouldn't have sided with that side of it, then the passing of it is an imposition on them of something they didn't agree to. So why these things in particular? Things like you've mentioned, the issue of life, sexuality, marriage. Why are those the things that are universal? Is that an arbitrary list, or what goes into that?
I'm sure it's an incomplete list. So people who spend a lot of time thinking about natural law, and lots of people over centuries have done that, would have more things to add. So it's an incomplete list, but it's definitely not arbitrary. What those all have in common is that they are natural. They're rooted in creation, and they are so because a good God has made a good world and desires good things for his creatures. That what these all have in common is that they're good, and that results in something extremely important for us to understand. I was at a pastor's conference last week in Chicago, and I was privileged to spend some time with a fellow pastor who had done some writing on transgenderism. He wrote in a theological journal a very good article, and we were talking about that, and he kept using the phrase "a human flourishing." And it's a phrase that I've been attracted to for a while. I don't know who coined it. I know Tim Keller uses it a lot, but others, and he was using it.
I actually came across it initially in some atheist writings, like Sam Harris, who wrote The Moral Landscape and a lot on morality, trying to arrive at an objective standard of morality from an atheist perspective. That's the flourishing of sentient beings is what he talks about.
Well, that's attractive to me because we're talking about a good from a good God. which is what makes this universal then and natural and rooted in creation.
That's important, I think, because let me interject this. When an atheist like Sam Harris proposes that as the standard, my immediate question is flourishing as defined by whom?
Exactly.
But when you have, because it's just all of us down here, in his mind, it's just all of us down here with our differing opinions of that.
Right.
But if you actually have an author of all of us, somebody who we originated with, well, that person knows what flourishing is because they defined it, they created it.
That's right. The only reason we know about flourishing or care about flourishing is because someone cared about it before we existed.
Right.
So these behaviors then that we're imposing are good for you. They're for human flourishing. God is good. His design is good. And we believers need to keep this in mind. My brother pastor that I was with last week, he had that emphasis. He presented his paper, and I very much appreciated it. He said, we really need to pound this home to our people, especially to our young people. God is good. It's a fallen world doesn't always look that way, but God is good, and what he says to do is good for human flourishing. And so the reason we want to impose it is not because we suffer from phobias, right? You're a homophobe. Okay. That's the best you can do. All right, but that's, throw the names out there and you're a homophobe. No, it's not because we suffer from phobias. Look, if I didn't care about you, just go and do whatever. I'm going to be fine, okay? I'm going to be fine. And certainly, ultimately, I'm going to be fine because of the relationship to God. But rather, the reason we emphasize this and the reason we're even willing to impose it is because you and others will suffer from deviant behavior, from deviations from the norm.
So back to something we kind of touched on just a second ago then. So that person will say, well, then who are you to tell me what's good for me?
And I retort, who do you have to be? Remind me who you have to be. In the marketplace of ideas, in a democracy with free speech, and people get to vote for people with positions that they choose. Remind me who it is you have to be. And in fact, so I ask that question, one, and then I also point out that all law is really someone's version of morality. So often you'll hear now, as related to the abortion question, who are you to tell me what I'm to do with my own body? And I've used this illustration before in the past. Imagine you're going along and you get pulled over by a cop, and the cop comes up and says, do you realize what you've done? And you say, no. And he says, there's a stop sign back there, and you went through it. And you said, okay, what's the problem with that? And he says, well, it says stop on it. And
seems arbitrary to me.
Yeah. So, and I say, so you're telling me that every time I see one of those octagonal red signs with white lettering that says stop, I'm to now take my foot off of the gas, and I'm to put it onto the brake. So one, why do you have a stop sign there? And he might say somebody might get killed. And my response is, well, who are you to cram your morality down my throat, okay? I don't care if anybody gets killed. And now you're telling me I got to take my foot off the accelerator and put it on so who are you to tell me what I'm to do with my own body? Now, it's a silly illustration that none of us would do, but we don't think about it very often. We don't think about the fact that our laws are rooted in, we don't want anybody to get hurt. We don't want anybody to get killed. And so we have things like stop signs, and we're willing to tell you what you have to do in order to keep that from happening. All law does that. So I'm seeking then to place reasonable natural law parameters over when we do it, rather than it just being, I want to impose everything that I believe you should do on you.
Yeah.
I want you to have freedom. And I want you to be able to choose within certain parameters to live your life the way you want to. But there are certain things, because they're rooted in natural law, that you don't have the right to violate. I don't expect all or most to agree with everything that we do, like you said. But I have no reservation about doing it in these instances, since it's part of natural law under which we all exist.
Yeah, and like you said, we're not trying to just be in everybody's business, but we truly believe these things are fundamental principles of the world God made.
That's right.
And it's for the best of the individuals in it and our society.
Yep.
So since it is connected, though, with God, the Creator, the one who gave the natural law, then people are going to see it as religious, and as us religious people imposing our religion on them and resent it. So it means we need to try to have the highest degree of moral integrity that we can before we go about doing
absolutely.
this, right?
Absolutely.
We've talked about this
Yes.
time and time again in recent years, and since we've been doing this podcast. We don't have to be sinless, of course, but we have to, and for example, we don't have to personally adopt a child just to say that abortion is wrong.
Which sometimes people say.
Yeah. Someone will say, well, who, unless you're how many kids have you adopted?
Yes.
Well, you can't.
Right.
I mean, we don't demand somebody tell us how many, criminals they put away, or off the top of my head, before they can say first degree murder is wrong.
Correct. That's right.
There's no condition. It's wrong.
Right.
It's wrong.
That's right.
So we certainly should, though, seek to ensure that we don't come off as inconsistent in our morality. We're telling people there are these natural laws. There are these things that are inherently wrong, and everybody should know it. Especially so when we're perceived as we're willing to impose it on you and make your life more difficult, we need to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to our own way of living. And we say this is right, this is wrong. Our behavior should line up with it.
Well, as you said, that's why the two of us have labored so hard over the last few years, especially to distance ourselves and our church from the most recent conservative political expression, which looks to the culture to be very, very inconsistent. And we've anticipated a day like this to come, where now it's going to explode on the national scene, that our imposition is really big on millions of people who really are angry about it and are going to be angry about it no matter what. I understand that. But I don't want to add to that anger.
We don't have to give them teeth to their criticisms.
Exactly. So I just this week met with our local state representative in Lansing at his request, and he expressed his dismay and his bewilderment that he's not a conservative. This guy's a liberal, okay? But he's bewildered. He goes, "Tell me, what's going on with conservative Christians that you guys could be so enthusiastically supportive of a president, a former president, whose lifestyle and behavior is so opposite Christian behavior?" And that comes off to him and to them as if we'll align with anyone to win, that the ends justify the means, that all's fair in war and politics. Now, I just want to hasten to remind folks that, look, and neither of us have voted for Democrats. We're never going to vote for the Democrats. I voted for Trump in 2016. Couldn't quite pull it off for myself in 2020. I had to vote for a third party. But, we're not saying you have to vote for a liberal. And even if you voted for Trump in both elections, our mantra has been vote, don't promote.
Yeah, and I hasten to add, he would have never been the candidate in 2016 had so many evangelicals not been behind him, I don't think.
So, and why do we care about that? We care about it because of what we're saying. You got guys like the state rep, they're just saying, I do not understand you guys aligning yourself that way. So when things like this happen, we need the highest degree of credibility that we can get. So don't do anything to harm that.
Yeah. Now, in contrast, though, and I just had somebody say this to me on Twitter today, that with the overturning of Roe, now this vindicates all the allegiance to President Trump appointed. He appointed these judges. He got the decision, got it done. Reagan couldn't do it. Bush couldn't do it. These were the exact words said to me. But I saw a guy tweet yesterday that we could have gotten just the same judges with another conservative president who was, in his words, a much more honorable person of character in the White House. So couldn't we have elected a noble conservative to do this thing? And he said this, of course, could have been accomplished if we had done that, and then we wouldn't be have any hesitancy in moving forward now with something like the overturning of Roe and being able to have the moral authority
we got the
when
high
we
moral
impose
ground.
this. Yeah.
But we've ceded that a bit, and that's I'm afraid of that.
So there's
now.
some teeth then to the accusation when he gets thrown back. Yeah.
However, let's make clear, because I know we talk about this. I know we agree. We're both thankful, very thankful, that President Trump appointed justices who voted to overturn Roe. And here it is. It happened. And we should acknowledge, and we do acknowledge, that that is a promise kept.
Yeah.
And man, we all know politicians break their promises, right? So that was a promise kept. That's a big deal. And it's brought about a result that other Republican presidents could not achieve. So I truly, and I know you do, we commend that and we're thankful for it. But what that tweeter and you and I are saying is, don't lose sight of the fact that this may well have happened for just about any of the nominees in 16. I just remind folks who say, well, Trump got it done. He did. Give credit where credit's due. But I've pointed out that what you don't think about, don't remember, is that he had a couple of things that the other presidents did not have. He had a Republican Senate. You have to have the Senate to confirm these nominees. And if you don't have the Senate confirm, and he not only had the Senate, he had in the last few years, it was 2014, don't hold me to that for sure, but just within the last few years, that the so-called nuclear option happened in the Senate, which meant you don't need 60 votes. You only need 51 votes. It used to be that the filibuster, and you needed 60 votes, you could filibuster a nominee. So you had to have an overwhelming majority of 60 at least in order to get, well, that's no longer the case. Trump has that luxury that George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush didn't have, Ronald Reagan didn't have, that the nuclear option happened. You just need 51 votes, and you had a Republican Senate to do it. And he had a second thing. He had the Federalist Society, and that group has matured such that they have built a deep bench of conservative justices, people who have experience on the federal bench. And they gave to the Trump campaign in 2016 a list of about 25 judges. Now, again, give credit to the Trump campaign. They won. They took that list and they said, we're going to pick people off of this list. And they did that.
Yeah.
So that's good. I'm just saying other presidents prior to that didn't have all of that.
Right. So another way beyond being careful about our political alliances that we can assure that we have maximum credibility is by now serving those who are affected by our imposition of law.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we refer to a lot of times as mercy ministries. And I think, and in anticipation of Roe being overturned at our church, we've talked a good bit about mercy ministries, talked about the establishment of a crisis pregnancy center, talked about trying to help make adoption more affordable by, as a church, helping people in our church with funding to do adoption, because those are the kinds of things over the next years and decades now that are going to be sorely needed.
Yeah. Well, this is very timely, hopefully helpful discussion to you as you listen, as you watch. And we try to make topics, we two pastors talking about Supreme Court here, we try to make topics that are relevant, but tie in important ways to our lives and what we understand about God from His Word. So hope this is helpful to you. We try to produce these every week, release them on Saturdays at 2 p.m. If you don't already, why don't you hit the subscribe button to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you know when the new episodes come out. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.